Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good day. I'm just going to have a little cup of tea. That'll help me to tell some stories today. It'll help all of us to tell some stories today. Today's stories will be White Fang, read by Mr. Nathaniel. We also will hear a new story called The Five Little Peppers or How They Grew, read by Miss Rebecca. Returning for more of a modern Cinderella or a very old shoe is Miss Haley Joe. And finally, we're going to hear more adventures of the story of Dr. Dolittle, read by Miss Kathleen. Enjoy. So we're going to get started. Have fun. See you in a little bit.
White Fang by Jack London. Chapter 3, The Hunger Cry. The day began auspiciously. They had lost no dogs during the night, and they swung out upon the trail and into the silence, the darkness, and the cold with the spirits that were fairly light. Bill seemed to have forgotten his forebodings of the previous night and even waxed facetious with the dogs when, at midday, they overturned the sled on a bad piece of trail. It was an awkward mix-up. The sled was upside down and jammed between a tree trunk and a huge rock, and they were forced to unharness the dogs in order to straighten out the tangle. The two men were bent over the sled and trying to right it when Henry observed One Ear sidling away. "Here you, One Ear," he cried, straightening up and turning around on the dog. But One Ear broke into a run across the snow, his traces trailing behind him. And there, out in the snow of their back track, was the she-wolf waiting for him. As he neared her, he became suddenly cautious. He slowed down to an alert and mincing walk and then stopped. He regarded her carefully and dubiously, yet desirefully. She seemed to smile at him, showing her teeth in an ingratiating rather than menacing way. She moved toward him a few steps playfully and then halted. One Ear drew near to her, still alert and cautious, his tail and ears in the air, his head held high. He tried to sniff noses with her, but she retreated playfully and coyly. Every advance on his part was accompanied by a corresponding retreat on her part. Step by step, she was luring him away from the security of his human companionship. Once, as though a warning had in a vague way flitted through his intelligence, he turned his head and looked back at the overturned sled, at his teammates, and at the two men who were calling to him. But whatever idea was forming in his mind was dissipated by the she-wolf who advanced upon him, sniffed noses with him for a fleeting instant, and then resumed her coy retreat before his renewed advances. In the meantime, Bill had bethought himself of the rifle, but it was jammed beneath the overturned sled, and by the time Henry had helped him to right the load, One Ear and the she-wolf were too close together and the distance too great to risk a shot. Too late, One Ear learned his mistake. Before they saw the cause, the two men saw him turn and start to run back toward them. Then, approaching at right angles to the trail and cutting off his retreat, they saw a dozen wolves, lean and gray, bounding across the snow. On the instant, the she-wolf's coyness and playfulness disappeared. With a snarl, she sprang upon One Ear. He thrust her off with his shoulder, and his retreat cut off and still intent on regaining the sled, he altered his course in an attempt to circle around to it. More wolves were appearing every moment and joining in the chase. The she-wolf was one leap behind One Ear and holding her own. "Where are you going?" Henry suddenly demanded, laying his head on his partner's arm. Bill shook it off. "I won't stand it," he said. "They ain't a-going to get any more of our dogs if I can help it." Gun in hand, he plunged into the underbrush that lined the side of the trail. His intention was apparent enough. Taking the sled as the center of the circle that One Ear was making, Bill planned to tap that circle at a point in advance of the pursuit. With his rifle, in the broad daylight, it might be possible for him to awe the wolves and save the dog. "Say, Bill," Henry called after him. "Be careful! Don't take no chances!" Henry sat down the sled and watched. There was nothing else for him to do. Bill had already gone from sight, but now and again, appearing and disappearing amongst the underbrush and the scattered clumps of spruce, could be seen One Ear. Henry judged his case to be hopeless. The dog was thoroughly alive to its danger, but it was running in the outer circle while the wolf pack was running on the inner and shorter circle. It was vain to think of One Ear so outdistancing his pursuers as to be able to cut across their circle in advance of them and to regain the sled. The different lines were rapidly approaching a point. Somewhere, out there in the snow, screened from his sight by trees and thickets, Henry knew that the wolf pack, One Ear, and Bill were coming together. All too quickly, far more quickly than he had expected, it happened. He heard a shot, then 2 shots, in rapid succession, and he knew that Bill's ammunition was gone. Then he heard a great outcry of snarls and yelps. He recognized One Ear's yell of pain and terror, and he heard a wolf cry that bespoke a stricken animal. And that was all. The snarls ceased. The yelping died away. Silence settled down again over the lonely land. He sat for a long while upon the sled. There was no need for him to go and see what had happened. He knew it as though it had taken place before his eyes. Once he roused with a start and hastily got the axe out from underneath the lashings, but for some time longer he sat and brooded, the 2 remaining dogs crouching and trembling at his feet. At last, he arose in a weary manner as though all the resilience had gone out of his body and proceeded to fasten the dogs to the sled. He passed a rope over his shoulder, a man trace, and pulled with the dogs. He did not go far. At the first hint of darkness, he hastened to make a camp, and he saw to it that he had a generous supply of firewood. He fed the dogs, cooked and ate his supper, and made his bed close to the fire. But he was not destined to enjoy that bed. Before his eyes closed, the wolves had drawn too near for safety. It no longer required an effort of the vision to see them. They were all about him in the fire. In the narrow circle, he could see them plainly in the firelight, lying down, sitting up, crawling forward on their bellies, or slinking back and forth. They even slept. Here and there, he could see one curled up in the snow like a dog, taking the sleep that was now denied himself. He kept the fire brightly blazing, for he knew that it alone intervened between the flesh of his body and their hungry fangs. His 2 dogs stayed close by him, one on either side, leaning against him for protection, crying and whimpering, and at times snarling desperately when a wolf approached a little closer than usual. At such moments when his dogs snarled, the whole circle would be agitated, and the wolves coming to their feet and pressing tentatively forward, a chorus of snarls and eager yelps rising about him. Then the circle would lie down again, and here and there a wolf would resume its broken nap. But this circle had a continuous tendency to draw in upon him. Bit by bit, an inch at a time, with here a wolf bellying forward and there a wolf bellying forward, the circle would narrow until the brutes were almost within springing distance. Then he would seize brands from the fire and hurl them into the pack. A hasty drawing back always resulted, accompanied by angry yelps and frightened snarls, when a well-aimed brand struck and scorched a too daring animal. Morning found the man haggard and worn, wide-eyed from want of sleep. He cooked breakfast in the darkness, and at 9 o'clock, when, with the coming of daylight, the wolf pack drew back, he set about the task he had planned through the long hours of the night. Chopping down young saplings, he made them crossbars of a scaffold by lashing them high up to the trunks of standing trees. Using the sled lashing for heaving rope, and with the aid of the dogs, he hoisted the coffin to the top of the scaffold. They got Bill, and they may get me, "But they'll sure never get you, young man," he said, addressing the dead body in its tree sepulcher. Then he took the trail, the lightened sled bounding along behind the willing dogs, for they too knew that safety lay upon in the gaining of Fort McGurry. The wolves were now more open in their pursuit, trotting sedately behind and ranging along on either side, their red tongues lolling about, their lean sides showing, the undulating ribs with every movement. They were very lean, mere skin bags, stretched over bony frames with strings for muscles, so lean that Henry found it in his mind to marvel that they still kept their feet and did not collapse forthright in the snow. He did not dare travel until dark. At midday, not only did the sun warm the southern horizon, but even thrust its upper rim pale and golden above the skyline. He received it as a sign. The days were growing longer. The sun was returning, but scarcely had the cheer of its light departed than he went into camp. There were still several hours of gray daylight and somber twilight, and he utilized them in chopping an enormous supply of firewood. With night came horror. Not only were the starving wolves growing bolder, but lack of sleep was telling upon Henry. He dozed despite himself, crouching by the fire, the blankets about his shoulders, the axe between his knees, and either side a dog pressing close against him. He awoke once and saw in front of him, not a dozen feet away, a big gray wolf, one of the largest of the pack. And even as he looked, the brute deliberately stretched himself after the manner of a lazy dog, yawning full in his face and looking upon him with a possessive eye, as if in truth he were merely a delayed meal that was soon to be eaten. This certitude was shown by the whole pack. Fully a score he could count, staring hungrily at him or calmly sleeping in the snow. They reminded him of children gathered about a spread table and awaiting permission to begin to eat. And he was the food they were to eat. He wondered how and when the meal would begin. As he piled wood on the fire, he discovered an appreciation of his own body which he had never felt before. He watched his moving muscles and was interested in the cunning mechanism of his fingers. By the light of the fire, he crooked his fingers slowly and repeatedly, now one at a time, now all together, spreading them wide or making quick gripping movements. He studied the nail formation and prodded the fingertips, now sharply and again softly, gauging the while the nerve sensations produced. It fascinated him, and he grew suddenly fond of his subtle flesh of his that worked so beautifully and smoothly and delicately. Then he would cast a glance of fear at the wolf circle drawn expectantly about him, and like a blow of realization would strike him with this wonderful body of his. This living flesh was no more than so much as meat, a quest of ravenous animals, to be torn and slashed by their hungry fangs, to be sustenance to them, as the moose and the rabbit had often been sustenance to him. He came out of a doze that was half nightmare to see the red-hued she-wolf before him. She was not more than half a dozen feet away, sitting in the snow and wistfully regarding him. The two dogs were whimpering and snarling at his feet, but she took no notice of them. She was looking at the man, and for some time he returned her look. There was nothing threatening about her. She looked at him merely with great wistfulness, but he knew it to be the wistfulness of an equally great hunger. He was the food, and the sight of him excited in her the gustatory sensations. Her mouth opened, the saliva drooled forth, and she licked her chops with the pleasure of anticipation. A spasm of fear went through him. He reached hastily for a brand to throw at her, but even as he reached and before his fingers had closed on the missile, she sprang back into safety, and he knew that she was used to having things thrown at her. She had snarled as she had sprang away, baring her white fangs to their roots, all her wistfulness vanishing, being replaced by a carnivorous malignity that made him shudder. He glanced at the hand that held the brand, noticing the cunning delicacy of the fingers that gripped it, how they adjusted themselves to all the inequalities of the surface, curling over and under and about the rough wood, and one little finger too close, the burning portion of the brand sensitively and automatically writhing back from the hurtful heat to a cooler gripping place. And in the same instant, he seemed to see a vision of those same sensitive and delicate fingers being crushed and torn by the white teeth of the she-wolf. Never had he been so fond of this body of his as now when his tenure of it was so precarious. All night, with burning brands, he fought off the hungry pack. When he dozed, despite himself, the whimpering and snarling of the dogs aroused him. Morning came, but for the first time the light of day failed to scatter the wolves. The man waited in vain for them to go. They remained in a circle about him and his fire, displaying an arrogance and possession that shook his courage, born of the morning light. He made one desperate attempt to pull out on the trail, but the moment he left the protection of the fire, the boldest wolf leaped before him, but leaped short. He saved himself by springing back, the jaws snapping together a scant 6 inches from his thigh. The rest of the pack was now up and surging upon him, and a throwing of firebrands right and left was necessary to drive them back to a respectful distance. Even in the daylight, he did not dare leave the fire to chop fresh wood. 20 feet away towered a huge dead spruce. He spent half the day extending his campfire to the tree, at any moment a half a dozen burning faggots ready at hand to fling at his enemies. Once at a tree, he studied the surrounding forest in order to fell the tree in the direction of the most firewood. The night was a repetition of the night before, save that the need for sleep was becoming overpowering. The snarling of his dogs was losing its efficacy. Besides, they were snarling all the time, and his benumbed and drowsy senses no longer took note of changing pitch and intensity. He awoke with a start. The she-wolf was less than a yard from him. Mechanically, at short range, without letting go of it, he thrust a brand full into her open and snarling mouth. She sprang away, yelling with pain, and while he took delight in the smell of burning flesh and hair, he watched her shaking her head and growling wrathfully a score of feet away. But this time, before he dozed again, he tied a burning pine knot to his right hand. His eyes were closed but few minutes when the burn of the flame on his flesh awakened him. For several hours he adhered to this program. Every time he was thus awakened, he drove back the wolves with flying brands, replenished the fire, and rearranged the pine knot on his hand. All worked well, but there came a time when he fastened the pine knot insecurely. As his eyes closed, it fell away from his hand. He dreamed. It seemed to him that he was in Fort McGurry. It was warm and comfortable, and he was playing cribbage with the factor. Also, it seemed to him that the fort was besieged by wolves. They were howling at the very gates, and sometimes he and the factor paused from the game to listen and laugh at the futile efforts of the wolves to get in. And then, so strange was the dream, there was a crash. The door burst open. He could see the wolves flooding into the big living room of the fort. They were leaping straight for him and the factor. With the bursting open of the door, the noise of their howling had increased tremendously. This howling now bothered him. His dream was merging into something else, he knew not what, but through it all, following him, persisted the howling. And then he awoke to find the howling real. There was a great snarling and yelping. The wolves were rushing him. They were all about him and upon him. The teeth of one had closed upon his arm. Instinctively, he leapt into the fire, and as he leapt, he felt the sharp slash of teeth that tore through the flesh of his leg. Then began a firefight, his stout mittens temporarily protecting his hands, and he scooped live coals into the air in all directions until the campfire took on the semblance of a volcano. but it could not last long. His face was blistered in the heat, his eyebrows and lashes were singed off, and the heat was becoming unbearable to his feet. The wolves had been driven back. On every side, wherever the live coals had fallen, the snow was sizzling, and every little while a retiring wolf with wild leap and snort and snarl announced that one such live coal had been stepped upon. Flinging his brands at the nearest of his enemies, the man thrust his smoldering mittens into the snow and stamped about to cool his feet. His 2 dogs were missing, and he well knew that they had served as a course to the protracted meal which had begun days before with Fatty, the last course of which would likely be himself in the days to follow. "You ain't got me yet," he cried, savagely shaking his fist at the hungry beasts. And at the sound of his voice, the whole circle was agitated. There was a general snarl, and the she-wolf slid up close to him across the snow and watched him with hungry wistfulness. He set to work to carry out a new idea that had come to him. He extended the fire into a large circle, and inside the circle he crouched his sleeping outfit under him as a protection against the melting snow. When he had thus disappeared with his shelter of flame, the whole pack came curiously to the rim of the fire to see what had become of him. Hitherto they had been denied access to the fire, and they now settled down in a close-drawn circle like so many dogs, blinking and yawning and stretching their lean bodies in the unaccustomed warmth. Then the she-wolf sat down, pointed her nose at a star, and began to howl. One by one, the wolves joined her, till the whole pack on haunches, with noses pointed skyward, was howling its hunger cry. Dawn came, and daylight. The fire was burning low. The fuel had run out, and there was need to get more. The man attempted to step out of his circle of flame, but the wolves surged to meet him. Burning brands made them spring aside, but they no longer sprang back. In vain he strove to drive them back. As he gave up and stumbled inside his circle, a wolf leaped for him, missed, and landed with all 4 feet in the coals. It cried out with terror, at the same time snarling and scrambling back to cool its paws in the snow. The man sat down on his blankets in a crouching position. His body leaned forward from his hips, his shoulders relaxed and drooping, and his head on his knees advertised that he had given up the struggle. Now and again he raised his head to note the dying down of the fire. The circle of flame and coals was breaking into segments with openings in between. These openings grew in size, and the segments diminished. "I guess you can come and get me any time," he mumbled. "Anyway, I'm going to sleep." Once he awakened, and in an opening in the circle directly in front of him, he saw the she-wolf gazing at him. Again he awakened a little later, though it seemed hours to him. A mysterious change had taken place, so mysterious a change that he was shocked, wider awake. Something had happened. He could not understand it first, and then he discovered it. The wolves were gone. Remained only the trampled snow to show how closely they had pressed him. Sleep was welling up and gripping him again. His head was sinking down upon his knees, and when he roused with a sudden start, there were cries of men and churn of sleds, the creaking of harnesses and eager whimpering of straining dogs. 4 sleds pulled in from the riverbed to the camp among the trees. Half a dozen men were about the man who crouched in the center of the dying fire. They were shaking and prodding him into consciousness. He looked at them like a drunken man and maundered in strange, sleepy speech. "Red she-wolf, come in with the dogs at it. Feeding time. First she ate dog food, then she ate the dogs, and after that, she ate Bill." "Where's Lord Alfred?" one of the men bellowed in his ear, shaking him roughly. He shook his head slowly. "No, she didn't eat him. He's roosting in a tree at the last camp. Dead? The men shouted. And in a box, Henry answered. He jerked his shoulder petulantly away from the grip of the questioner. Say, you let me alone. I'm just plump tuckered out. Good night, everybody. His eyes fluttered and went shut. His chin fell forward on his chest. And even as they eased him down upon the blankets, his snores were rising on the frosty air. But there was another sound. Far and faint it was in the remote distance, the cry of the hungry wolf pack as it took the trail of other meat than the man it had just missed.
Thank you, Mr. Nathaniel. That's great. I can't wait to hear more about White Fang and the adventures. Next up, we have Miss Rebecca, who will be reading a new book called The 5 Little Peppers. So, Miss Rebecca, enjoy, everyone.
Hi, I'm Miss Rebecca. Today I will be reading a bit of 5 Little Peppers and How They Grew by Margaret Sidney. But first, I need my reading bonnet. 5 Little Peppers, a home view. The little old kitchen had quieted down from the bustle and confusion of midday, and now, with its afternoon manners on, presented a holiday aspect that, as the principal room in the brown house, it was eminently proper it should have. It was just on the edge of the twilight, and the little Peppers, all except Ben, the oldest of the flock, were enjoying a breathing spell, as their mother called it, which meant some quiet work suitable for the hour. All the breathing spell they could remember, however, poor things. For times were always hard with them nowadays, and since the father died, when Phronsie was a baby, Mrs. Pepper had had hard work to scrape together money enough to put bread into her children's mouths and to pay the rent of the little brown house. But she had met life too bravely to be beaten down now. So, with a stout heart and a cheery face, she had worked away day after day at making coats and tailoring and mending of all descriptions. And she had seen with pride that couldn't be concealed her noisy, happy brood growing up around her and filling her heart with comfort and making the little brown house fairly ring with jollity and fun. Poor things, she would say to herself. They haven't had any bringing up. They've just scrambled up. And then she would set her lips together tightly and fly at her work faster than ever. I must get schooling for them some way, but I don't see how. Once or twice she had thought, now the time is coming, but it never did. For winter shut in very cold, and it took so much more to feed and warm them that the money went faster than ever. And then, when the way seemed clear again, the store changed hands, so that for a long time she failed to get her usual supply of sacks and coats to make. And that made sad havoc in the quarters and half-dollars laid up as her nest egg. But, well, it'll come sometime, she would say to herself, because it must. And so at it again she would fly, brisker than ever. To help Mother was the great ambition of all the children, older and younger. But in Polly's and Ben's souls, the desire grew so overwhelmingly great as to absorb all lesser thoughts. Many and vast were their secret plans, by which they were to astonish her at some future day, which they would only confide, as they did everything else, to one another. For this brother and sister were everything to each other and stood loyally together through thick and thin. Polly was 10 and Ben 1 year older. And the younger 3 of the 5 little Peppers, as they were always called, looked up to them with the intensest admiration and love. What they failed to do couldn't very well be done by anyone. Oh dear, exclaimed Polly. As she sat over in the corner by the window helping her mother pull out basting threads from a coat she had just finished, and giving an impatient twitch to the sleeve. "I do wish we could ever have any light, just as much as we want." "You don't need any light to see these threads," said Mrs. Pepper, winding up hers carefully as she spoke on an old spool. "Take care, Polly. You broke that. Thread's dear now." "I couldn't help it," said Polly vexedly. "It snapped. Everything's dear now, it seems to me. I wish we could have, oh, ever and ever so many candles, as many as we wanted. I'd light them all, so there, and have it light here one night all the time." "Yes, and go dark all the rest of the year, like as anyway," observed Mrs. Pepper, stopping to untie a knot. "Folks who do so never have any candles," she added sententiously. "How many'd you have, Polly?" asked Joel, curiously, laying down his hammer and regarding her with the utmost anxiety. "Oh, 200, said Polly decidedly. "I'd have 200 all in a row." 200 candles, echoed Joel in amazement. "My walkety, what a lot!" "Don't say such dreadful words, Joel," put in Polly nervously, stopping to pick up her spool of basting thread that was racing away all by itself. "'Tisn't nice." "'Tisn't worse than to wish you'd got things you haven't," retorted Joel. "I don't believe you'd light 'em all at once," he added incredulously. "Yes, I would, too," replied Polly recklessly. 200 of 'em, if I had a chance, all at once, so there, Joey Pepper." "Oh," said little Davy, drawing a long sigh, "why, 'twould be just like heaven, Polly, but wouldn't it cost money, though?" "I don't care," said Polly, giving a flounce in her chair, which snapped another thread. "Oh, dear me, I didn't mean to, Mammy. Well, I wouldn't care how much money it cost, about the candles. We'd have as much light as we wanted for once, so—" "Mercy," said Mrs. Pepper, "you'd have the house afire. 200 candles? Who ever heard of such a thing?" "Would they burn?" asked Phronsie, anxiously, getting up from the floor where she was crouching with David, overseeing Joel nail on the cover of an old box, and going to Polly's side. Phronsie awaited her answer patiently. "Burn?" said Polly. "There, that's done now, Mamsie dear," and she put the coat with the last little pat into her mother's lap. "I guess they would, Phronsie pet." And Polly caught up the little girl and spun her around and round the old kitchen till they were both glad to stop. "Then," said Phronsie, as Polly put her down and stood breathlessly after her last glorious spin, "I do wish we might, Polly. Oh, just this very 1 minute." And Phronsie clasped her fat little hands in rapture at the thought. "Well," said Polly, giving a look up at the old clock in the corner, "dearie me, it's 5:30, and most time for Ben to come home." Away she flew to get supper, so for the next few moments nothing was heard but the pulling out of the old table into the middle of the floor, the laying the cloth, and all the other bustle attendant upon the being ready for Ben. Polly went skipping around, cutting the bread and bringing dishes, only stopping long enough to fling some scraps of reassuring nonsense to the two boys, who were thoroughly dismayed at being obliged to remove their traps into a corner. Phronsie still stood just where Polly left her. 200 candles. Oh, what could it mean? She gazed up to the old beams overhead and around the dingy walls and to the old black stove with the fire nearly out, and then over everything the kitchen contained, trying to think how it would seem to have it bright and winsome and warm to suit Polly. "Oh!" she screamed. "Goodness," said Polly, taking her head out of the old cupboard in the corner. "How you scared me, Phronsie." "Would they ever go out?" asked the child gravely, still standing where Polly left her. "What?" asked Polly, stopping with a dish of cold potatoes in her hand. "What, Phronsie?" "Why, the candles," said the child. "The ever and ever so many pretty lights." "Oh, my senses," cried Polly with a little laugh. "Haven't you forgotten that already? Yes, no, that is, Phronsie, if we could have 'em at all, we wouldn't ever let 'em go out." "Not once?" asked Phronsie, coming up to Polly with a little skip, and nearly upsetting her, potatoes and all. "Not once, Polly, truly?" No, not forever and ever, said Polly. Take care, Phronsie. There goes a potato. Oh, we'd keep them always. No, you don't want to, said Mrs. Pepper, coming out of the bedroom in time to catch the last words. They won't be good tomorrow. Better have them tonight, Polly. The potatoes, she means. Ma'am, said Polly, setting down her potato dish on the table and staring at her mother with all her might. Have what, mother? Why, the potatoes, to be sure, replied Mrs. Pepper. Didn't you say you better keep them, child? 'Twasn't potatoes at all, said Polly with a little gasp. 'Twas, dear me, here's Ben. For the door opened, and Phronsie, with a scream of delight, bounded into Ben's arms. It's just jolly, said Ben, coming in, his chubby face all aglow and his big blue eyes shining so honest and true. It's just jolly to get home. Supper ready, Polly? Yes, said Polly. That is, all but... And she dashed off for Phronsie's eating apron. Sometime, said Phronsie, with her mouth half full when the meal was nearly over, we're going to be awfully rich. We are, Ben, truly. No, said Ben, affecting the most hearty astonishment. You don't say, chick. Yes, said Phronsie, shaking her yellow head very wisely at him and diving down into her cup of very weak milk and water to see if Polly had put any sugar in by mistake. A proceeding always expectantly observed. Yes, we really are, Benzie, very dreadful rich. I wish we could be rich now, said Ben, taking another generous slice of the brown bread, in time for Mamsie's birthday, and he cast a sorrowful glance at Polly, his sister. I know, said Polly. Oh dear, if we only could celebrate it. I don't want any other celebration, said Mrs. Pepper, beaming on them so that a little flash of sunshine seemed to hop right down on the table. I don't want any other celebration than to look round on you all. I'm rich now, and that's a fact. Mamsie, don't mind her 5 brothers, cried Polly, jumping up and running to hug her mother, thereby producing a like desire in all the others, who immediately left their seats and followed her example. A great big hug. Mother's rich enough, said Miss Pepper, her bright black eyes glistening with delight as the noisy troop filed back to their bread and potatoes. If we can only keep together, dears, and grow up good, so that the little brown house won't be ashamed of us, that's all I ask. Well, said Polly, in a burst of confidence to Ben, after the table has been pushed back against the wall, the dishes nicely washed, wiped, and set up neatly in the cupboard, and all traces of the meal cleared away, she said, well, I don't care. Let's try and get a celebration somehow for Mamsie. How are you going to do it? Asked Ben, who was of a decidedly practical turn of mind, and thus couldn't always follow Polly in her flights of imagination. I don't know, said Polly, but we must some way. Pho, that's no good, said Ben disdainfully. Then, seeing Polly's face, he added kindly, let's think, though, and perhaps there'll be some way. Oh, I know, cried Polly in delight. I know the very thing. Ben, let's make her a cake, a big one, you know, and she'll see you bake it, said Ben, or else she'll smell it, and that'd be just as bad. No, she won't either, replied Polly. Don't you know she's going to help Mrs. Henderson tomorrow? So there. So she is, said Ben. Good for you, Polly. You always think of everything. And then, said Polly, with a comfortable little feeling at her heart at Ben's praise, why, we can have it all out of the way splendidly, you know, when she comes home. And besides, Grandma Bascom will tell me how. And, you know, we've only got brown flour, Ben. I mean to go right over and ask her now. Oh, no, you mustn't, cried Ben, catching hold of her arm as she was preparing to fly off. Mammy'll find out. Better wait till tomorrow. And besides, Polly. And Ben stopped, unwilling to dampen this propitious beginning. The stove will act like everything tomorrow. I know 'twill. Then what'll you do? But it shan't. It'll work, said Polly, running up to look it in the face. If it does not work, I'll shake it, the mean old thing. The idea of Polly's shaking the lumbering old black affair sent Ben into such a peal of laughter that it brought all the other children running to the spot, and nothing would do but they must one and all be told the reason. So Polly and Ben took them into confidence, which so elated them that half an hour after, when long past her bedtime, Phronsie declared, "I'm not going to bed. I want to sit up like Polly." "Don't tease her," whispered Polly to Ben, who thought she ought to go. So she sat straight up on her little stool, winking like everything to keep awake. "I'm staying awake." At last, as Polly was in the midst of one of her liveliest sallies over, tumbled Phronsie asleep, a little sleepy little heap upon the floor. "I want to go to bed," she said. "Take me, Polly." "I thought so," laughed Polly, and bundled her off into the bedroom.
And we also have Miss Haley Joe, who will be joining us to read some more of the Louisa May Alcott, A Modern Cinderella, or A Little Old Shoe. Miss Haley Joe?
Hi friends, it's Miss Haley again. I'm back to keep reading A Modern Cinderella. So just a refresher, last week, Nan's father left town, and so John had come over and was helping Nan out around the kitchen, and he had just left and all the girls were waving and Nan threw her shoe at him. So now we will continue on and see what happens next in our story. Nan never felt alone now in this charmed wood. For when she came into its precincts, once so full of solitude, all things seemed to wear one shape. Familiar eyes looked at her from the violets in the grass, familiar words sounded in the whisper of the leaves, grew conscious that an unseen influence filled the air with new delights, and touched earth and sky with a beauty never seen before. Slowly, these Mayflowers budding in her maiden heart, rosily they bloomed, and silently they waited till some lover of such lowly herbs should catch their fresh aroma, should brush away the fallen leaves, and lift them to the sun. Though the eldest of the three, she had long been overtopped by the more aspiring maids, but though she meekly yielded the reins of government whenever they chose to drive, they were soon restored to her again, for Dee fell into literature, and Laura into love. Thus engrossed, these two forgot many duties which even blue stockings are expected to perform, and slowly all the homely humdrum cares that housewives know became Nan's daily life, and she accepted it without a thought of discontent. Noiseless and cheerful as the sunshine, she went to and fro, doing the tasks that mothers do, but without a mother's sweet reward, holding fast the numberless slight threads that bind a household tenderly together, and making each day a beautiful success. Dee, being tired and of running, riding, climbing, and boating, decided at last to let her body rest and put her equally active mind through what classical collegians term a course of sprouts. Having undertaken to read and know everything, she devoted herself to the task with great energy, going from Sue to Swedenborg with great impartiality, and having different authors as children have sundry distempers, being fractious as they lasted, but all the better for them once over. Carlyle appeared like scarlet fever and raged violently for a time, for being anything but passive bucket, Dee became prophetic with Mahomet, belligerent with Cromwell, and made the French Revolution a veritable reign of terror to her family. Goethe and Schuyler alternated like fever and ague. Mephistopheles became her hero, Joan of Arc her model, and she turned her black eyes red over Egmont and Wallenstein. A mild attack of Emerson followed, during which she was lost in a fog, and her sisters rejoiced inwardly when she emerged, informing them that the Sphinx was drowsy and her wings were furled. Poor Dee was floundering slowly to her proper place, but she splashed up a good deal of foam by getting out of her depth, and rather exhausted herself by trying to drink the ocean dry. Laura, after the midsummer night's dream that often comes to girls of 17, woke up to find that youth and love were no match for age and common sense. Philip had been flying about the world like a thistledown for 25 years, generous-hearted, frank and kind, but never with an idea of the serious side of life in his handsome head. Great, therefore, were the wrath and dismay of the enamored thistledown when the father of his love mildly objected to seeing her begin the world in a balloon, with a very tender but very inexperienced aeronaut for a guide. Laura is too young to play house, yet you are too unstable to assume the part of lord and master, Philip. Go and prove that you have prudence, patience, energy, and enterprise, and I will give you my girl. But not before. I must seem cruel, that I may be truly kind. Believe this, and let a little pain lead you to a great happiness, or show you where you should have made a bitter blunder. The lovers listened, owned the truth of the old man's words, bewailed their fate, and yielded. Laura for the love of her father, Philip for the love of her. They went away to build a firm foundation for his castle in the air, and Laura retired to an invisible convent, where she cast off the world and regarded her sympathizing sisters through a grate of superior knowledge and unshareable grief. Like a devout nun, she worshipped Saint Philip, and firmly believed in his miraculous powers. She fancied that her woe set her apart from common cares, and slowly fell into a dreamy state, professing no interest in any mundane matter, but the art that first attracted Philip. Crayons, bread crusts, and gray paper became glorified in Laura's eyes, and her pleasure was to sit pale and still before her easel day after day, filling her portfolios with the faces he had once admired. Her sisters observed that every Bacchus, piping faun, or dying gladiator had some likeness to a comely countenance that heaven, god, or hero never owned. And seeing this, they privately rejoiced that she had found such solace for her grief. Mrs. Lord's keen eye had read a certain newly written page in her son's heart, in his first chapter of that romance begun in paradise, whose interest never flags, whose beauty never fades, whose end can never come till love lies dead. With womanly skill she divined the secret, with motherly discretion she counseled patience, and her son accepted her advice, feeling that, like many, a healthy herb, its worth lay in its bitterness. Love like a man, John, not like a boy, and learn to know yourself before you take a woman's happiness into your own keeping. You and Nan have known each other all your lives, yet, till this last visit, you never thought you loved her more than a childish friend. It is too soon to say the word, so often spoken hastily, so hard to be recalled. Go back to your work, dear, for another year. Think of Nan in the light of this new hope. Compare her with comelier, gayer girls, and by absence prove the truth of your belief. Then, if distance only makes her dearer, if time only strengthens your affection, and no doubt of your own worthiness disturbs you, come back and offer her what any woman should be glad to accept. My boy's true heart. John smiled at the motherly pride of her words, but answered with a wistful look. It seems very long to wait, mother. If I could just ask her for a word of hope, I could be very patient then. Ah, my dear, better bear 1 year of impatience now than a lifetime of regret hereafter. Nan is happy. Why disturb her by a word with which will bring the tender cares and troubles that come soon enough with such conscientious creatures as herself? If she loves you, time will prove it. Therefore, let the new affection spring and ripen as your early friendship has done, and it will be all the stronger for a summer's growth. Philip was rash and has to bear his trial now, and Laura shares it with him. Be more generous, John. Make your trial. Bear your doubts alone, and give Nan the happiness without the pain. Promise me this, dear. Promise me to hope and wait. The young man's eyes kindled, and in his heart there rose a better chivalry, a truer valor than any of these knights had ever known. I'll try, mother, was all he said, but she was satisfied, for John seldom tried in vain. Oh, girls, how splendid you are! It does my heart good to see how handsome my sisters are in their best array, cried Nan one mild October night as she put the last touches to a certain airy raiment fashioned by her own skillful hands, and then fell back to survey with grand effect Dee and Laura were preparing to assist in an event of the season, and Nan, with her own locks fallen on her shoulders for want of sundry combs promoted to her sister's head, and her dress in unwonted disorder, for lack of the many pins extracted and exciting crises of the toilet, hovered like an affectionate bee about two fully blown flowers. Laura looks like a cool undine with ivy wreaths in her shining hair. And Dee has illuminated herself to such an extent with those scarlet leaves that I don't know what great creature she resembles most, said Nan with beaming sister admiration. Like Juno, Zenobia, and Cleopatra simmered into one, with a touch of Xantip by way of spice. But to my eye, the finest woman of the three is the disheveled young person embracing the bedpost, for she stays at home herself and gives time and taste to making homely people fine, which is a waste of good material and an imposition on the public. As Dee spoke, both the fashion plates looked affectionately at the gray-gowned figure, but, being works of art, they were obliged to nip their feelings in the bud and reserve their caresses till they returned to common life. Put on your bonnet, and we'll leave you at Miss Lord's on her way. It will do you good, Nan, and perhaps there may be news from John, added Dee, as she bore down upon the door like a man-of-war under full sail. Or from Philip, sighed Laura with a wistful look. Whereupon Nan persuaded herself that her strong inclination to sit down was owing to want of exercise, and the heaviness of her eyelids a freak of imagination. So, speedily soothing her ruffled plumage, she ran down to tell her father of the new arrangement. Go, my dear, by all means. I shall be writing, and you will be lonely if you stay. But I must see my girls, for I caught glimpses of certain surprising phantoms flitting by the door. Nan led the way, and the two pyramids revolved before them, the rapidity of lay figures, much to the good man's edification. For his fatherly pleasure, there was mingled much mild wonderment at the amplitude of array. Yes, I see my geese are really swans, though there is such a cloud between us that I feel way off and hardly know them. But this little daughter is always available, always my cricket on the hearth. As he spoke, her father drew Nan closer, kissed her tranquil face, and smiled content. Well, if I ever see pictures, I see 'em now, and I declare to goodness it's as interesting as play acting every bit. Miss Dee with all them bows in her hair looks like the Queen of Sheby, and she went a-visitin' what's-his-name, and if Miss Laura ain't as sweet as Lally Barster figure, I should like to know what is. In her enthusiasm, Sally gamboled about the girls, flourishing her milk pan like a modern Miriam, about to sound her timbrel for excess of joy. Laughing merrily, the two Montblancs bestowed themselves in the family ark. Nan hopped up beside Patrick, and Solon, roused with his lawful slumbers, morosely trundled them away. By looking backwards with the last good night, Nan saw her father still standing by the door with smiling countenance, and the moonlight falling like a benediction on his silver hair. Betsy shall go up the hill with you, my dear, and here's a basket of eggs for your father. Give him my love, and be sure you let him know that next time he is doing poorly, said Mrs. Lord, when her guests rose to depart after an hour of pleasant chat. But Nan never got the gift, for, to her great dismay, her hostess dropped the basket with a crash and flew across the room to meet a tall shape pausing in the shadow of the door. There was no need to ask who the newcomer was, for even in his mother's arms, John looked over her shoulder with an eager nod to Nan, who stood among the ruins with never a sign of weariness in her face, nor the memory of a care at her heart, for they all went out when John came in. And that is all the time that we have today. I will see you guys back next week for more. Bye, guys!
The final story for today is continuing with the story of this guy, Dr. Dolittle. If you remember, when I introduced you to this story a while back, we talked about a creature called a push-me-pull-you. Well, we're going to start to get to know what that creature is in the next few chapters. So I'm going to start reading chapter 8, which is called The Lioness. And then we're chapter 9, which we start to learn a little bit about what that push me pull you is. And then maybe if we have time, if not next time, we'll actually get to meet the push me pull you. So let's get started. The story of Dr. Dolittle. Chapter 8. The Leader of the Lions. John Dolittle now became dreadfully, awfully busy. He found hundreds and thousands of monkeys sick. Gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, baboons, marmosets, gray monkeys, red ones, all kinds. And many had died. The first thing he did was separate the sick ones from the well ones. When he got Chi-Chi and his cousin to build him a little house of grass, the next thing he did was he made all the monkeys that were still well come and be vaccinated. And for 3 days and 3 nights, the monkeys kept coming from the jungles and the valleys and the hills to that little house of grass where the doctor sat all day and all night, vaccinating and vaccinating. Then he had another house of grass made, a big house, one with lots of beds in it, and he put all the sick monkeys in that house. So there were so many sick monkeys that there weren't enough well ones to nurse the sick monkeys. So the doctor sent messages to other animals, like the lions and the leopards and the antelopes, to come help him with the nursing. But the leader of lions was a very proud creature, and when he came to the doctor's house, full of beds, he seemed angry and scornful. "Do you dare, sir," he said, glaring at the doctor, "do you dare ask me, the king of beasts, to wait on these dirty monkeys? Why, I wouldn't even eat them between my meals." Although the lion looked very scary, the doctor tried not to seem afraid of him. "I didn't ask you to eat them," he said quietly. "And besides, they're not dirty. They've all had a bath this morning. Your coat looks as though it needed brushing badly. Now listen, and I'll tell you something. The day may come when the lions get sick. And if you don't help the other animals now, the lions may find themselves left all alone when they are in trouble. That often happens to proud beings. The lions are never in trouble. They only make trouble," said the leader, turning up his nose, and he stalked away into the jungle, feeling as if he had been smart and clever. Then the leopards got proud and said they wouldn't help. And then, of course, the antelope, although they were too shy and timid to be rude like the lion was, they pawed the ground and smiled foolishly, and they said they had never been nurses before. And now the poor doctor was worried and frantic, wondering where he would get help enough to take care of all those thousands of monkeys in bed. But the leader of the lions, when he got back to his den, saw his wife, the queen lioness, come running out to meet with her hair untidy. "One of the cubs won't eat," she said. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with him. He hasn't taken a thing since last night." And she began to cry and to shake with nervousness, for she was a good mother. And even though she was a lioness. So the leader went into his den and looked at his children, two very cunning little cubs, lying on the floor. And one of them did seem quite poorly. Oh, you. Then he told the lion. Let's start again. Then he told the lion, his wife, quite proudly, just what he had said to the doctor. And she got so angry that she nearly drove him out of the den. "You never did have a grain of sense," she screamed. "All the animals from here to the Indian Ocean are talking about this wonderful man and how he can cure any kind of sickness and how kind he is. The only man in the whole world who can talk the language of the animals. And now, when we have a sick baby on our hands, you must go and offend him? You great booby! Nobody but a fool is ever rude to a good doctor. You!" And she started pulling her husband's hair. "Go back to that man at once," she yelled, "and tell him you're sorry, and take all the other empty-headed lions with you, and those stupid leopards and antelopes too. Then do everything that the doctor tells you. Work hard, and perhaps he will be kind enough to come see our cub later. Now be off. Hurry, hurry, I tell you. You're not fit to be a father." Arr! And she went into the den next door, where another mother lion lived, and she told her all about it. So the leader of the lions went back to the doctor and said, "I just happened to be passing this way and thought I'd look in on you. Got any help?" "No," said the doctor. "I haven't, and I'm dreadfully worried." "Help's pretty hard to get these days," said the lion. "Animals don't seem to want to work anymore. You can't blame them in a way. Well, seeing you're in difficulties, I don't mind doing what I can just to oblige you, so long as I don't have to wash those creatures. And I've told all the other hunting animals to come and do their share. The leopards should be here in any moment. Oh, and by the way, we've got a sick cub at home. I don't think it's anything to be worried about myself, but the wife, she's anxious. If you're around that way this evening, you might take a look at him. Will you?" Then the doctor was very happy, for all the lions and the leopards and the antelopes and the giraffes and the zebras, all the animals of the forests and the mountains and the plains came to help him in their work. There were so many of them that he actually had to send some of them away. And now, very soon, the monkeys began to get better. And at the end of the first week, the big house full of beds was only half full. And at the end of the second week, the last monkey got well. Then the doctor's work was done, and he was so tired, he went to bed and slept for 3 days without even turning over. Chapter 9. The Monkey Council. Chi-Chi stood outside the doctor's door, keeping everybody away till he woke up. Then John Dolittle told the monkeys that he must go back to Puddleby. They were surprised at this, for they had thought that he was going to stay with them forever. And that night, all the monkeys got together in the jungle to talk it over. And the chief chimpanzee rose up and said, "Why is it that this good man is going away? Is he not happy with us?" But none of them could answer him. Then the grand gorilla got up and said, "I think we should all go to him and ask him to stay. Perhaps if we make him a new house with a bigger bed and promise him plenty of monkey servants to work with him and make life pleasant for him, perhaps he will not wish to go." Then Chi-Chi got up and all the others whispered, "Shh, look, Chi-Chi, the great traveler is about to speak." And Chi-Chi said to the other monkeys, "My friends, I'm afraid it is useless to ask the doctor to stay. He owes money in Puddleby, and he says he must go back and pay it." And the monkeys asked him, "What is money?" And then Chi-Chi told him that in the land of men, you could get nothing without money. You could do nothing at all without money, and that it was almost impossible to live without money. And some of them asked, "But you can't even drink or eat without money, without paying?" But Chi-Chi shook his head. And then he told them that even he, when he was an organ grinder, had been asked to ask children for money. And the chief chimpanzee turned to the oldest orangutan and said, "Cousin, surely these men are strange creatures. Who would wish them to live in such a land? My gracious, how paltry." Then Chi-Chi said, "When we were coming to you, we had no boat to cross the ocean and no money to buy food to eat on our journey. So a man lent us some biscuits, and then we said we would pay him when we got back. And then we borrowed a boat from a sailor, but it was broken on the rocks when we reached the shores of Africa. So now the doctor says that we have to go back and get the sailor another boat, because the man was poor and the ship was all he had." And the monkeys were all silent for a while, sitting quiet and still upon the ground and thinking hard. At last, the big baboon got up and said, "I think we ought to let this good man leave our land, but we won't let him leave without giving him a fine present to take, so he may know that we are grateful with all that he has done for us." And the little tiny red monkey who was sitting up in a tree said, "I think so too." And then they all cried out, making a great noise, "Yes, yes, yes, let us give him fine presents. Finest a man ever had." And now they began to wonder and to ask one another what that present might be. And one said, 50 bags of coconuts, and another 100,000 bananas. At least he shall not have to buy fruit in his land. But Chi-Chi told him that all these things would be too heavy to carry, and besides, they would go bad before half of it was eaten. "If you want to please him," he said, "give him an animal. You may be sure he will be kind to it. Give him some rare animal that they don't have in menageries." And the monkeys asked him, "What's a menagerie?" And the Chi-Chi said, "Well, these are places in the land of men where animals are put in cages for people to come look at." And the monkeys were very shocked and said to one another, "These men are thoughtless young ones, stupid and easily amused. Shh, these are prisons. They want to put animals. That's what he means." So then they asked Chi-Chi, "What rare animal could it be that they should give the doctor? One that man had never seen before. And then the major of the marmosets asked, have they a iguana over there? But Chi-Chi said, yes, there's one in the London Zoo. And another asked, have they okapi? But Chi-Chi said, yes, in Belgium, where my organ grinder took me 5 years ago. They had an okapi in a city they call Antwerp. And then another asked, have they a push me pull you? Then Chi-Chi said, no man has ever seen a push me pull you. Let's give him that. And so the next chapter, chapter 10, which will be next time, you're going to see what a push me pull you is. And that's it for Story Hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I hope you come back next week for both more classic stories as well as these chapter books. And tell your friends and tell them to like us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We want lots of people to hear these stories. And remember, all these stories are in public domain, and you can find them online. And you can read along if you want. Or you can go to the library and get a book yourself. So, until next time, keep reading